Very pleasant good morning to each and every one of you. I would encourage you to open up your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, we'll be reading starting in verse 11 in just a quick moment. I appreciate the presence of everybody that is here. We have quite a few visitors that are in the audience. We have a lot of people that are in because of family reasons. We also kind of conversely have a lot of people that are out because of family reasons, because of the holiday weekend. But whatever the reason is that you've chosen to be with us, I appreciate not only your desire to be with your physical family, but also your spiritual family as well. That's really what we are here at Hillside. We strive to be a spiritual family in everything that we do, trying to build each other up, trying to strengthen each other, and that's certainly what we want to do this morning as we worship God together. You know, it's funny when you look at as a lot of Paul's epistles, and you kind of see this in every single one of them, even in this book that you're currently in, Ephesians, you see a lot of times where Paul kind of talks about specific individuals. If you look, for instance, at the last part of the book of Romans, he lists off a whole bunch of names, and Romans 16 is one of those chapters that just seems to be like, it's kind of a big, shout out to every single person he's ever met in his entire life. He talks about Phoebe, he talks about Priscilla and Aquila, he talks about Aristobulus, talks about all these different names of all these different people that we can only assume meant quite a bit to him throughout his everyday life. And just as it is with all of him, or with him, every single book to kind of talk about these different people, it also seems kind of a custom of ours to more or less skip over them. We get to chapter 15, then we open up chapter 16, we see this long list of names, we kind of scan to see if there's any exhortative information, is there anything I need to learn? We don't think there is, and so we move on to the next book. But I would encourage you, if you find one of these, and they're really basically in every one of Paul's epistles, I would encourage you to take a few moments and just kind of read through them. Because when you look at these things, when you slow down and read these different names that take place in chapters like this, what you notice are a lot of little tidbits, a lot of little nuggets that Paul makes that give glimpses into his everyday life. We don't really know a whole lot about Paul as a person, who he is, and so these chapters help out quite a bit with that. But what you also realize when you look at these chapters is different makeup of the early church. For instance, if you look at a lot of these names, you'll see women, you'll see men, you'll see royalty, you'll see servants, you'll see people from basically every different part of life. You also see people that are Greeks, you see people that are Gentiles, you also see people that are Jewish names, which kind of shows the demographic makeup of the early church at that point. As a matter of fact, in Romans chapter 16, on at least 6 different occasions, Paul not only talks about people, he also says, they are my kinsmen in the flesh. Now, a lot of people have speculated maybe that's Paul talking about his own personal family. I tend to think that that's just his Jewish compatriots. He would say something very similar, for instance, in Colossians and in the book of Philemon. But I think what you see when you notice these things is that Paul is addressing specific individuals that were very, very close to him. And you can't help but read some of these things and ask the obvious question is, what about his actual family? When he addresses certain people in these types of lists, and he says, this person is a kinsman in the flesh, the one thing you kind of vaguely notice in the back end of all that is Paul at no point ever really discusses his physical family. And that's interesting primarily for a Jew. I don't know much about my family history. I don't know where my family came from. I only met I never ever met my great-grandparents on either side of my family, so I don't have a whole lot of depth in that regard. But for a Jew, genealogy was everything. Not only did you know who your father was, who your grandfather was, but you knew who your 10th great-grandfather was. And if you were really fortunate, you could trace the lineage all the way back to somebody hopefully pretty famous, that you could kind of piggyback off of that same reputation as you made your way in the Jewish world. And so genealogy was very important for these people, not only backwards but also forwards. If you were a Jew, it was almost expected of you, and the Psalms bear this out over and over again, it was almost expected of you that you would bear as many children as humanly possible, that you would just have all sorts of kids so that you could keep that line moving forward. And so the fact that Paul at no point, at any point in his letters, with the exception of the mention of a nephew in Acts chapter 18, never ever talks about his physical family. I think that's noteworthy. But what you do notice him talking a lot about is his spiritual family. For instance, in Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 11, this is one of those chapters that does a great job of showing how Jews and Gentiles come together. And that's really the main point of this, is that this middle wall has been broken down. But notice in this chapter how he reaches out to a group of people that were previously cast aside, at least in the Jewish world. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 11, he says, therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands, remember Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ. You were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and you were strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. What a fantastically uplifting statement. But now in Christ Jesus, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one man, thus establishing peace. And he might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, and having put to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who are far away, and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have our access in one Spirit to Father. Now listen to this. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built on that foundation, the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. Paul really doesn't mince words in there, does he? He starts by talking about something that's surprisingly negative. He says, don't forget that at one point, every single person in your immediate vicinity, all these Jews, used to not think a whole lot about you. Don't forget that. And if the letter had stopped there, it would have been a surprisingly depressing letter. But he says, remembering that, think about how far forward you've come. That now, because of God's sacrifice, that wall has been broken down. And moreover, he builds in that to reestablish that unity, or to establish that unity by saying, you who were strangers are now brought near. You were apostate, you were apart from us, but now you are part of God's household. And Paul doesn't really mince words at any point in this chapter, in this book, when he talks about the unity that we enjoy as a member of God's household. Which goes exactly with what Dad talked about in Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50, where Jesus looks out amongst all of his people, and the people walk up to him and they say, your mother and your brothers are sitting there waiting for you. And Jesus, as stoic as ever, and this would have been a really big deal to those people, as serious as ever, looks out and says, you want to know who my mother and my brothers are? Here's my mother and my brothers. My spiritual family is what's important to me. That's what Paul emphasized. That's what Jesus emphasized. And in case you think that Paul is just paying lip service to this statement, this idea of a spiritual family, he actually talks about something here in Romans chapter 16 that I had largely overlooked almost every single time I had ever read this. In Romans the 16th chapter and verse 13, for instance, there's a passage, there's a little verse where he says, greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine. Kind of continuing along with the same theme of Paul and not ever really addressing his physical family. At one point here in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, Paul openly addresses his spiritual mother. Now, we could stop the sermon right here. We could just kind of make all these points about this idea all we want, but the text goes just a little bit deeper than this, because Rufus is not just some random person that we don't know anything about. In Mark the 15th chapter, verse 21, it says, talking about Jesus' leading away to his crucifixion, it says, they pressed into service a passerby coming in from the country, Simon of Cyrene, who is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Almost every single time when you see names that are brought out in Scripture of Christians, they're almost always people that they could identify with. And so it is a very, very, very strong possibility that the person that Paul is addressing here in Romans chapter 16 and verse 13 is the son of the man who helped Jesus carry the cross to Golgotha. What an amazing dinner table that must have been. To sit at the dinner table not only with Alexander and Rufus, these two guys you're probably friends with, but also Simon of Cyrene and his wife. And as Paul got to know that family, as we can only assume from these two verses, as Paul got to know that family, you can almost imagine the types of things that Simon's wife would have then given to Paul. The stories that Rufus would have heard directly from Simon of Cyrene, who was there when Jesus died. And there's no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, that at least on some level, strengthened Paul's faith. I don't know how it doesn't. I don't know how you have an interaction with these types of people and not be strengthened as a result. Paul wasn't fortunate enough, at least as we could ever tell, to see Jesus in the flesh during his earthly ministry. I know he appeared to him, but he didn't accompany him on his ministry. So having these conversations with people like Rufus, people like Simon, Alexander, Simon's wife, really, really important to somebody like Paul. And they built him up and they strengthened him. People like this, ladies and gentlemen, are invaluable. Close spiritual relationships that you can lean on in your life through everything. They're so valuable. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 24 says, a man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. What he talks about in Proverbs chapter 18 is having quality over quantity. Instead of having just a whole bunch of friends that you can hang out with at any point in time, where you can do all these different things with and go all these different places and have all these different activities, there is an emphasis in Proverbs chapter 18 verse 24 on quality. The fact that I'm not friends with 400 people, I may be really close friends with 4 people who know me inside and out, who can lean on me. And I can lean on them. And as Christians, ladies and gentlemen, we have that built into the spiritual family. We have 100 plus people at this congregation that we should look to as our spiritual family, that we can lean on, that they can lean on us, that they can trust, that we can trust. That's what we have as Christians. That is an invaluable asset to all of us. But a true Christian family, true brothers and sisters, are not just people in name only. They are people who will help us, encourage us to get to heaven. Our association, ladies and gentlemen, is not in blood, but in purpose. Our fellowship is not in genealogy, but it's in goal, it's in mission. And for that reason, I believe exactly what he says there in Proverbs 18 and verse 24, that there are friends who stick closer than a brother. I have people in my own life that will help me spiritually, that I can lean on, that I can talk to. And when I err off the side for whatever reason, they say, hey, you need to get your life back on track. You need to focus on what's important. You don't need to be doing that type of stuff. You need to be doing this type of stuff. There's an African proverb when Christianity first hit Africa in the first few centuries after Christ was crucified. There are stories about how these small Christian communities would oftentimes go outside of the village to pray. And so a lot of people, noticing that they would go out to pray, would watch how their knees had worn down the areas where they would get on their knees and pray. And at the time, if those areas became overgrown, they would talk to their brother and say, brother, your knee area is overgrown. You need to get back on track with God. True Christian friends, brothers and sisters, will do that for you. True Christian friends will help us get to heaven. That's what it's all about. The 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22 says we need to abstain from every form of evil. And sometimes we need those close friends that will help us with that. That will identify areas where we need to get back on track. That's what a spiritual family does. And I would argue, too, that's exactly what Paul had in this woman. Was somebody who he counted on as a spiritual mother that could help him understand, help him grow, help him learn more. And in reality, that's what mothers do, isn't it? Today is the day that we commonly associate as Mother's Day. And so to all of you who are out there who are mothers, happy Mother's Day to you. You are to be glorified. You're to be thanked. I see that much more as a dad. You're especially to be thanked for all that patience that you've had throughout the years. But to those people out there who are spiritual mothers, even if you're not a physical mother, thank you for your devotion to the other generations. Thank you for your devotion to not just physical family, but also to spiritual family. I can look at a number of people in my life that I've had ever since I was little, that I look at as spiritual moms, that have been there for me when I've needed them, that have helped me, that have guided me, that have strengthened me, that have encouraged me. And those types of women are invaluable, because they provide a few things that only a mother really knows how. First and foremost, they know how to teach you. I think it's very interesting in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15, when Paul is talking to Timothy, he says, I'm reminded of the faith that was first in your grandmother Lois and then in your mother Eunice. I like how he isolates the grandmother first and then goes to the mother. But he says, from those two women, you have known the sacred scriptures which are able to make you wise unto salvation. What you don't see, at least in that passage, in understanding Timothy's Gentile fatherly lineage, it probably makes sense. But what you don't see in that passage is really any emphasis on the male. You don't see the father picking up the slack. You don't see the father ever in that. And that's not to mean necessarily that he's not in the picture. But what this passage does show is the value of having a strong woman at home. It's a figure in your life. Let's face it, guys, and as I've just said, as a father, I see this a lot more now. Let's face it, guys, oftentimes we are not always the first person that our kids turn to when they need help. Now, if Logan needs baseball help, he needs help with his swing, I'm right there. But when Logan cries, he doesn't always come to me. Most of the time, he comes to his mother, and for good reason. Those early years of your life, those years where you're very new, where you're very, explorative about the world, you need somebody that can teach you and somebody that can guide you. And so what you see happening there in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5 is the impact of a strong woman when that child is young to instill truth into them. Train up a child in the way he's old, or the way he's supposed to go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Learn or remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days draw near and the years grow, where you say, I have no need of them. There's an emphasis placed on teaching children when they're young the way that they should go. And spiritually speaking, that's what we need to have. I was blessed to have a strong mother in my life. And this is not, by the way, my substitution for Mother's Day gifts. But I was blessed to have a strong mother in my life. I am blessed to be married to a very strong mother. But I was also blessed in my early life to have a lot of Bible class teachers that taught me every single Sunday and Wednesday the elements, the basic fundamentals of what it meant to be a child of God. I don't remember a time in my life where I didn't know anything about Noah, where I don't remember anything about Jonah, where I never heard the story of David and Goliath. I don't remember a time in my life where I didn't know that. And so oftentimes we take stuff like that for granted, but we can directly trace them back to the women in those early years that taught us what we needed to do to become a child of God. And so if you're a Bible class teacher this morning, let me just take a brief second to say thank you for what you've done. Thank you for taking time out of your life and teaching our kids a little bit of what they need to do to be a child of God. Those Bible class teachers are invaluable. Those spiritual women in your life that are invaluable to helping us grow as Christians. In Titus chapter 2, for instance, starting in verse 3, the emphasis that Paul places on this in Titus chapter 2 is on intentionality. We sometimes think that this instruction just kind of happens, that this instruction just kind of appears all of a sudden, when in reality it's the result of intentionality, intentional purpose in teaching other people. I'll get to Titus at some point, you just hang out. Titus chapter 2 and verses 3 through 5. There's not enough thumb tabs for me to know where to go. Titus 2 and verse 3. He says, older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, so that they may then encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. I've read Titus 2, verses 3 through 5 quite a bit. I've read it for sermons, I've read it for Bible classes, I've read it in my own personal study, but sometimes we miss what he's really addressing here. If you look at the things that he talks about there in verses 3 through 5, there is the aspect of intentionality. But more than that, when he says this in Titus 2, verses 3 through 5, he doesn't ever say, I want you to teach the younger women the basic nuts and bolts of Christianity. I want them to understand the Trinity. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I want them to understand Calvinism at its root so that they can go out there and defend it against the wiles of the devil. He doesn't say that either. He says, I want the older women to put Christianity in practical, everyday perspective. I want you to teach them to be reverent. I want you to teach them to be hospitable. I want you to teach them to be good mothers, good wives. I want you to teach them the everyday practical applications about what it means to be a strong woman of God. I can talk all day long about theology, and we can talk about doctrine, we can talk about baptism, we can talk about all these different things, but the one thing I can't do for your kids is put it in every single practical day application. That's where a mother comes in, and a father. That's where parents come in. And a strong woman in the household who teaches their child not just what type of backpack to wear on the first day of school, but also how to be a Christian in that school. That's invaluable. Christian mothers also nurture other people. I want you to look at the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1, I love this story of Ruth. And the more I read it, the more I realize that the main character in the story is obviously Ruth, but Naomi's up there too. Naomi is not as important of a figure as Ruth in the story, but Naomi doesn't deserve to be overlooked either. In Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 8, after her own husband and her 2 sons had passed away, which I cannot imagine the heartache that would give to this woman, It says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law, this is in verse 6, so that she might return from the land of Moab. For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her daughters-in-law with her. They went on their way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead, and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. She's doing these women a favor. It says, then she kissed them, they lifted up their voices and wept. And both of them, both Ruth and Orpah, said to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. Orpah gets a bad rap because she eventually did go back to her homeland, but at least initially she was willing to stick to her guns and hang out with Naomi, which promised absolutely nothing in regards to her future. Naomi said in verse 11, return, my daughters, why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may also be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I'm too old to even have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. There's no doubt that in this instance, Naomi is doing exactly what she believes is in the best interest of these two women, which is allowing them to go back to their homeland, allowing them to restart their life, to find a husband, have children, to build something of themselves. And Orpah gets a lot of disdain for actually going back, but I think it says a lot about her that Ruth or Naomi even had this attitude towards these two daughters-in-law. Verse 14, they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And I want you to pay special attention to what she says here. She said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. For thus may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. If you've ever been to any wedding I've ever officiated, you've heard me read this because it just fits so perfectly with this. But notice what he's saying in this passage. What Ruth is saying in this passage is not, we're going to mix our cultures together. She's not at any point saying, your God will be my God will be your God. She doesn't say that. She doesn't say, my people will be your people will be my people. She doesn't say that. She says, your people are going to be my people. Your God is going to be my God. I am looking at you, Ruth says, as a spiritual mother. And all throughout the rest of this book, you see that same thing happen over and over and over again, where Ruth interacts with Boaz for the first time and apparently has forgotten how to talk to a guy, and so Naomi helps her. And then Naomi helps her a little bit more, and then Naomi helps her a little bit more. And then when you notice at the end of the book, when Ruth has a child with Boaz, at the very end of this book is not about Ruth at all. The end of the book is about the child that is placed, David's grandfather, that is placed on Naomi's lap, and she becomes a mentor for him. There's a certain sense in which some of these women that we kind of scoot on past to look at the bigger stories deserve more attention. For instance, did we ever stop to think about the fact that Jochebed in Exodus chapter 1, who looked and saw that Moses was beautiful, which is exactly what my mom said to me 34 years ago. Now, Jochebed looked at Moses and saw that he was beautiful and knew that the best thing in his interest was to place him in the river and hope that God would take care of him. And God did take care of him. Moses became the man that he was because Jochebed was then allowed to be his nurse from that point forward. There's no doubt the conversations that took place. And even though Jochebed leaves the picture relatively early in this entire story, there's no doubt the impact that she makes in there. 1 Samuel chapter 21, we're not going to read 1 Samuel 21 through 28. That would be a lot. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. You see the story of Hannah, who is the person we named our daughter after. I love this story. And Hannah is somebody who prays desperately for a child. And when she finally gets the child, she brings the child, as she promised God, to Eli. She's going to be raised by Eli. Eli's temple, the tabernacle, that whole family. But that doesn't mean that Hannah left the picture. Hannah weans him, gives him over to Eli, and then every single year brings a robe to that child. In a day when transport was not really that easy. Every single year brings a robe to that child to help him along the way. Ultimately, when you look at the way that a mother nurtures her child, It's a lot of the way that God nurtures us. I don't think there's an accident that when you look at a lot of these scriptures that talk about God's relationship with us, you see the same thing taking place. And Deuteronomy chapter 32, for instance. Deuteronomy chapter 32, starting in verse 7. Listen to how God talks about his relationship with these people. Deuteronomy chapter 32, starting in verse 7. Moses speaks in this passage, saying, remember the days of old. Consider the years of all generations. Ask your father, he'll inform you. Your elders, they'll tell you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, and he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel, for the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. He found him, verse 10, in the desert land. And in the howling waste of a wilderness, he encircled him. He cared for him. He guarded him as the pupil of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young, he spread his wings and caught them. He carried them on his pinions. The Lord alone guided him. There was no foreign God with him. He made him ride on the high places of the earth. He ate the produce of the field. He made him suck honey from the rock, oil from the flinty rock, curds of cows, milk of the flock, with fat of lambs, and rams the breed of Bashan, goats, with the finest of the wheat, and of the blood of grapes you drink wine. You get a strong nurturing image from God. That not only did he lead them out of Egypt by a mighty hand and have all these plagues and signs, all these different things that took place, but that along the way he nurtured them. That's really what nurturing is, isn't it? It's a little bit different from teaching, where you diligently instruct them in the way things are going. You model certain things, and they imitate you. Nurturing is providing the things for them that they can't always do for themselves. That's what a mom does. A mom recognizes with her infant, with her children, no matter what the age is, they recognize certain things that they need, maybe before they even realize what they need. And the spiritual moms that we have in our life, the spiritual moms that talk to us, understand that as well. They help us understand what we need to progressively move forward towards God, closer towards him, rather than away from him. So all of those out there who are spiritual moms, whether you're a physical mom or not, thank you for that. And if you're somebody who doesn't have children, maybe your children are grown, maybe you're a grandparent, maybe you just want to have 2 jobs, think of yourself as a spiritual mom. And see the ways that you can influence those who are younger than you. See the way that you can help, even people who are your age, people who are older than you, how you can help teach and how you can help nurture them towards God. That's the charge that's given to all of us. But it's a job that's done especially well by the strong women that are, at least in my life, that I've noticed throughout my life. I've always thought it was fascinating that Paul mentions very briefly there in Romans chapter 16, blessed be Rufus, or say thank you to Rufus, and his mom, his mother, and mine. There's no telling what that relationship was like. But whatever it was enough to impact Paul until the day that he died. That's the impact of a spiritual family. And if you're not a part of that family, I would encourage you to become a part of that family. And if we can help you with that in any way, won't you come as we stand, as we sing.